Here we go. Hello. So, welcome everyone. I'm Paul Sievers, Associate Professor of Literary Studies at Bucknell and Deacon at St. John's Russian Orthodox Church in Lewisburg. It's my privilege to welcome Professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto to Bucknell and Lewisburg. I do so on behalf of the Bucknell Program for American Leadership, a faculty think tank which I direct, and also of the Open Discourse Coalition of Bucknell alumni and friends, a Lewisburg-based educational foundation that made tonight's event possible. Thank you, generous donors. Professor Peterson has been called the most prominent public intellectual in the world today. His books have sold millions of copies, and we are pleased to host him in his first public appearance in more than 2.5 years. Professor Peterson's academic work on personality assessment has earned him scholarly respect. His public work engages perennial aspects of what makes us human and how to flourish as human beings, as witnessed by many traditions and cultures in the face of challenges of growing up in the 21st century. His topic tonight is free speech as a precondition for mental and social health. The relationship between free speech and health at both individual and social levels is highlighted in much of Professor Peterson's work, including his exploration of the psychology of totalitarianism. In his foreword to the 50th anniversary edition of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, Professor Peterson referenced the tens of millions who died under communism in the past century in severe deprivation of free expression. He eloquently concluded, "May God himself eternally fail to forgive us if in the painstakingly revealed aftermath of such bloodshed, torture, and anguish, we remain stiff-necked, incautious, and unchanged." Solzhenitsyn warned that it can happen here in the West, and we should be wise in discerning the cultural climate on the horizon. Students at Bucknell tell me of the stress they experience when they feel unable to speak freely and feel forced to perform like actors in agreeing with slogans and advocacies of professors indoctrinating them in certain ideologies. Faculty find themselves unfairly targeted by ostracism and hostility because of non-conforming cultural identities and views. Something deeply unhealthy stirs in our intellectual life nationwide. Today, as always, standing up for free expression as fundamental to human life comes at a cost demanding sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice on behalf of free expression as a human need can be glimpsed nearby us tonight. In the Lewisburg Cemetery next to campus lies a young Bucknellian who took seriously the signs of his times. George H. Raymer, class of 1950. After service in World War II fighting Nazism, George graduated from Bucknell and went to work teaching civics at Lewisburg High School. When the Korean War began, he re-enlisted to fight the spread of communism. Wounded in combat, refusing aid for himself, he fought single-handedly to his death to cover the withdrawal of injured fellow soldiers, receiving the Medal of Honor. Thankfully, we are not in direct physical warfare for the cause of free expression on American college campuses today, but we face increasingly high-stakes intellectual and social challenges in American intellectual life, which arguably threaten mental and ultimately physical health, both as individuals and as a nation. George Raymer's courage uplifts us. So too, in psychology and media, do Professor Peterson's insights on this topic today help inspire us with courage. Now I turn to Isabella Carrega, Bucknell class of 2022, an honored student advocate of free speech on this campus, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Professor Sievers. Before I begin my introduction, I would like to remind the audience of the Weiss Center policy on tonight's event. Please turn off all electronics for the duration of the evening. Filming is strictly prohibited, and there will be additional time at the conclusion of the lecture for Q&A. They say all roads lead to Rome, but in this age of technology, I think we can agree that all late-night YouTube video binges lead to a recommended Jordan Peterson lecture video. My first encounter with Dr. Peterson's work was my sophomore year of high school in 2016, when I stumbled upon an interview in which he gave various opinions on religion, myth, science, and truth. It evoked for me important aspects of the mystery of life and of human nature, the need for both self-discipline and creativity. Little did I know that only a few years later, I would be standing in front of a large audience at a major university, introducing him in person. There is no denying the profound impact of Dr. Peterson's principles and wisdom, which he so generously shares with the world. Dr. Peterson says in his book, 12 Rules for Life, that when you have something to say, silence is a lie. That rule has informed my academic work as a student, as president of Bucknell Conservatives Club, as an elected official in my native New Jersey, and as a student affiliate with the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and the Open Discourse Coalition. The liberal arts tradition, at its finest, is about thoughtful dialogue and problem solving. Involving diversity of cultural and philosophical viewpoints is essential to that process. The Open Discourse Coalition, founded just 1 year ago, does just that, facilitating the liberal arts tradition of Bucknell and ensuring that intellectual diversity is upheld. Some months ago, the Open Discourse Coalition asked students on campus who they wanted to hear from during this academic year. Jordan Peterson was by far the overwhelming choice. I should note, as Professor Sievers mentioned earlier, that this is Dr. Peterson's first public appearance in more than 2.5 years. For that, we are both honored and elated to have been his first choice as well. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Peterson to Bucknell.
Free speech as a precondition for mental and social health. What does free mean? Freud discovered that if you brought people who were suffering into a clinical setting, and you let them, and you prepared a space for them where they could say anything they felt like saying, that a psychological transformation would occur, that their thought would wander of its own accord, in some sense, precisely to those areas that were most deeply disturbing and unsettling to them. And that as a consequence of that wandering, they would attain a certain clarity and psychological stability that was not evident before that. Now, Freud has become quite the whipping boy in recent years, and I think that's the fate of geniuses whose revelations are so profound that 100 years we take them for granted as second nature and only see the errors that are left behind. Carl Rogers, who was arguably, he was one of the greatest clinical psychologists of the last half of the 20th century, said something that was an elaboration of the Freudian notion in some sense. Of course, and Rogers had been informed by what Freud had discovered and what other people had developed in the line of clinical treatment, psychiatric treatment. Rogers, who was raised as a Protestant and who wanted to be an evangelist when he was a teenager and went to university, but partly because of the scientific training that he had also obtained from his father, who had applied scientific management techniques to his farm, fell prey to the conflict between scientific and religious thinking and became agnostic, or at least atheistic, but maintained his central faith in the redeeming quality of the untrammeled word. He believed and put forth as an element of psychological doctrine that the primary goal of the therapist who was attempting to foster the mental health and, let's say, the cessation of the suffering, unnecessary suffering of his clients, was required, above all, to listen. Now, listening, that's a hard thing. And why? Because sometimes you hear things you don't want to hear. And you can't make light of that. And you can't say, well, you should just put up with it, because we don't know exactly how to put up with it, because sometimes you really hear things that you don't want to hear, and you're hurt because of it, and that hurt can be deep. And so it's hard to listen. And so Roger said, you think you listen, but you don't. Here's a little experiment, he said. The next time that you're engaged in a dispute with someone, and so let's say this is someone in your family, and you're having a hard time reaching an accord, and so you're suffering the conflict that lack of peace necessarily produces, and they see things differently than you do, and they're trying to make a case for their perspective, which might involve the revelation of something that undermines one of your cherished beliefs, or even an accusation about your misbehavior. Will you listen? Well, why wouldn't you? Well, you don't want to be wrong. You don't want to be to blame. You want to convince yourself that what you already know is enough. You want to convince yourself that you're good in your current state. And you certainly don't want to allow yourself to be deeply disturbed by the revelation of an unpleasant truth that you cannot deny. And so you're motivated not to listen. And how might you not listen? Well, you can indicate your anger, you can indicate your displeasure, you can do that without using words, you can glare, you can roll your eyes. That's a good way to get divorced, by the way. I'm dead serious. The best predictor of divorce, if you're a couples counselor, is eye rolling. And that's disgust. And once the relationship is degenerated because of lack of communication, perhaps, malevolence, perhaps, ignorance, and there's nothing left but disgust, there's nothing left of the relationship. How do you know if you were listening? Well, Roger said, here's a way you can check yourself, and this is unbelievably useful. You can actually do this, and if you do it, it will change your life. If you do it seriously, if you make it a practice, right? If you make it part of you, it will change your life completely. When someone talks to you, you have to restate back what they said in terms they agree with. And that means you don't play any tricks, right? You can't twist their words. You can't defend yourself with all the little tricks you've learned to defend yourself, all the deceptive tricks that protect what you already know. You have to adopt their point of view. You have to do it with sincerity, and you have to reflect it back to them. And they have to agree. Now, Roger said, if you do that, most of the emotion will go out of the discussion. That's not necessarily true. But it's often true, because a lot of conflict is simply a matter of misunderstanding, sometimes just terminological misunderstanding. That's certainly true in philosophical discourse, but it's also very frequently true in ordinary discourse. And so you can at least be sure that if you can restate back to the person what they said, they know you were listening. Well, what does that mean, that they know that you were listening? It means that you acted out the proposition that they had something worth